welcome to the second episode of this relatively new podcast series dedicated to exploring careers in science. My name is Sean Hughes. I'm a chemistry teacher at John Abbott College, and I have started this series to shed light on the many opportunities that await high school, CEGEP, and even university students that are interested in pursuing jobs in science. And thinking back to my own experience in school, I always had an interest in science. I loved it. But apart from the usual suspect jobs, like a doctor or an engineer, I really wasn't sure what I could do with a science education. And so I hope that those of you listening to this series can see better what some of the wonderful opportunities are that await you should you elect to pursue science. And I hope that this series can also put a spotlight on the jobs that you may not have ever thought of. Okay, my guest today is Dr. Fiorenzo Vetrone. My friend Fior is a professor of nanobiotechnology and is currently employed at l'Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique, the INRS. Prior to working there, he worked as a Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council postdoctoral fellow at L'Université de Montréal and again through the INRS. Fior went to school in Montreal, obtained a bachelor's degree at Concordia University in chemistry, and finally completed his PhD at Concordia University in chemistry with yours truly. Welcome, Fiorenzo.
Thank you, Sean. It's good to be here and good to see you again.
Always a pleasure. It's been way too long. Way too long.
Indeed.
Okay, so with that in mind, before we get started, I have a question that's been nagging at me for the last few weeks. And being that you're a man that I hold in tremendous respect, I figured you would be the person to answer this question. Is it l'Impact de Montréal or is it Club de Foot Montréal?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I'm very partial to the name Impact because as you know, I've played soccer for many years at some of the highest levels in this province, and I've had friends who played with the Impact, and so it holds a special place in my heart. So I'm not too fond of this rebranding, and particularly not fond of the logo as well.
I had to laugh because if it was CF Montreal, I could have lived with it. When you call it Club de Foot, at least
Yes.
Club de Football, I could have lived with. But Club de Foot, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't know who's in charge of their marketing, but anyway.
Okay, I'm going to take it a step further now.
Yes.
Is it really the Montreal Impact? Or is it the Montreal Supra? Or is it the Montreal Manic?
Oh, no, it's definitely the Manic. I mean, I remember as a young kid going and watch the Manic games with my dad and his friends and my friends, and it was just a tremendous, tremendous experience. You know, the Olympic Stadium was full. It was crazy watching the greats play. And for me, the Manic will always be the Manic. Always.
I never got to see the Manic myself. I never even got to see the Supra. I only went to see the Impact maybe a couple times in the USL. And then when they made it big, of course, I went to go see at Stade Saputo. But the only time I went to see a soccer game in the Big O was when Beckham came to town. Mm-hmm. And that was a hell of a spectacle. And that place was loud. The field was crap, but it was quite the atmosphere.
I mean, I remember a lot of good games at the Big O. Actually, I think the last soccer game I watched at the Big O was the World Cup. I believe it was under 21 World Cup. That was some good soccer as well.
So you mentioned that soccer is very important to you. In what ways was soccer important to you growing up, and what lessons did you learn from playing soccer?
Well, I mean, you know, being born to Italian parents, I mean, soccer was part of our DNA, if I can say that. My family is from the Naples area, and so I remember as a kid getting up and going to the bars. At the time, it wasn't very easy to watch Serie A at home. So most people went to, you know, Italian bars and watch the games. And I remember going with my dad. Some of the best memories I have and watching Maradona play. And when Maradona passed away a few months ago, it affected me, I have to say, because it felt like a part of my childhood was gone. You know, and I guess we'll probably talk about it later. But my parents are both deceased now, and so that was, you know, like I said, I had some incredible memories of, you know, going and watch these games. And when Maradona died, it just felt like closure. And in terms of what lessons it taught me, honestly, excelling at sports, and I think like anything else, I like to think of it like a pyramid or like an iceberg, I should say, where what everybody sees is the tip of that iceberg, but in reality, it's everything underneath, everything underwater that matters. And to be good on game day, I think you have to really work incredibly hard and sacrifice and put in your all and give it your all.
So, at the same time that you're developing this love for soccer as a child, at some point in time, you started to develop a love for science. How early on was that love for science? Was it also as a kid, or was it when you were in high school, or did it come much later?
Oh no, I was as a kid. I remember always wanting to be. It's like I lived in two worlds, in the sports world and in the science world. And I remember I always wanted to be a scientist until a certain age, and we'll probably again get to this later. But I kind of managed to balance both. Kind of always, want to be a scientist, and I've always loved science.
What's your fondest memory as a kid growing up, sort of exploring science and trying to understand the natural world, if something stands
Um,
out?
I can't say a single thing stands out, to be honest. I remember as a kid, I went to an astronaut camp, and that really cemented my love for science and sort of put me on a path, I guess, to where I am today. More or less, I always wanted to be an astronaut. That was one of my dreams. Didn't materialize, but yeah, I think that camp really was what set me on this path.
In high school, was it a matter of you knew you were going into CEGEP Sciences and then you knew you were going to university thereafter? That was always part of the plan.
It was. Things got a little bit derailed along the way. It was the plan from, I did all the sciences in high school, knowing that I would study chemistry or study sciences. I really always loved chemistry. So study sciences in CEGEP. And so I did my deck in pure and applied science and then went off to university. But along the way, during my bachelor's in science, I got a little bit bored of chemistry or science, to be honest. And so I did a complete left turn and started to study English literature. And
Wow.
so I took small break from science and science courses and studied English. And then it was a chance meeting with Professor John Capobianco at Concordia Chemistry that brought me sort of back into the fold.
What was it about studying chemistry in such depth that may have turned you off the subject temporarily?
I didn't particularly enjoy the organic chemistries, the analytical chemistries, the more wet chemistries. It wasn't for me. I found there was a lot of memorization. There was a lot of, I just didn't find it interesting. And at some point, I realized that I should at least finish my bachelor's degree. And at the time at Concordia, you needed to do a 6 credit, a year long research project. And so basically, essentially, you had to find a supervisor, find a faculty member, and kind of spend a year in their lab doing a mini, if you want to call it a mini thesis or whatever it is. And so I again, I knew that I didn't want to do it in this organic or in analytical chemistry and so I went to see John Capobianco, and he brought me to his lab, and he turned on his lasers, and I realized that chemistry is just not about mixing things. It's also about the interaction of light with matter, and that wowed me. And the rest is history. I haven't stopped since that day.
So it's funny you mentioned, at some point you hit this fork in the road in your education. And I remember as a CEGEP student, I really enjoyed chemistry and I really enjoyed biology. And at the time, I was still maybe thinking a little bit about med school, but I also thought about I just want to know more about these topics. Like I
Mhm.
wasn't in a rush to go be a doctor. And it's something my mom always used to tell me was keep your options open, keep your options open. Look at what else is out there. But I remember it was time to apply for university and I was questioning, well, what do I apply to? And then I took organic chemistry and it cemented for me in a way that I didn't want to go that chemistry route because it wasn't something I particularly enjoyed for exactly the same reasons you said. Although I have a tremendous amount of respect for people who
Totally.
understand and can live in that field and the amazing things they do. Ironically, I still went into a field that required a lot of memorization and rote learning at times. But there was something about the organic chemistry field that didn't sit well with me either. And it was again through that chance sort of opportunity that in meeting Dr. Capianco through a course I was taking at the science college, where he introduced me to this other spectrum, if you will, of chemistry that I didn't know existed coming out of CEGEP. I say without hyperbole, it was a life-changing experience to have been exposed to that. And like you said, the rest was history, and that was the path I was on at that point. Were there any other hurdles for you in your educational journey?
No, the answer is no. After spending that initial period in John Capobianco's lab, I decided to pursue master's and PhD in his group. So I kind of knew from the moment I started that this is what I wanted to do. And I knew again from the moment I started that I wanted to go into academics. I wanted to be a university professor. There was some hiccups along the way. I lost both my parents during graduate school, so that wasn't easy. So I had to deal with not only the loss of both my mother and my father within 14 months of each other, but also the fact that my sister, who was somewhat younger than me, was an undergraduate at the time. And so, there was a lot of other things to worry about than just science and just research. But things worked out. I had to, of course, rethink my future. The beauty of academia is that the world is your oyster, essentially. But I decided to, for personal reasons, to stay in the Montreal area. And that's why I decided to pursue a postdoc, again, in the Montreal area. And ultimately, I found a faculty position, again, in Montreal. So that it worked out.
Yeah, so why don't you just share with us a little bit, what was the kind of stuff that you were studying as a graduate student? What made working for John so interesting?
As a grad student, we were working on a very, very new topic at the time, and that was light emitting nanoparticles. And I can't stress this enough. It was a completely new field, and almost every experiment resulted in, findings and research results that were worthy of publication. So I had a very successful PhD, and that kind of propelled me, into the postdoc and to the faculty position. But yeah, it was a new field, light emitting nanoparticles. We managed to publish the first paper in the field, which in 2000, I think it was. And today there are thousands of papers being published, yearly on this topic.
So then your work in this field takes you to the INRS at Université de Montréal for your postdoc.
Yeah.
What was different about that experience? What were you working on there, and how is it related to what you had done previously?
So it's completely different. When you do the jump from the PhD to the postdoc, there are essentially two schools of thought. Either you continue along the same path as your PhD, and so you become very specialized in this particular topic, or you branch out. And towards the end of my PhD, we started to think about the application of these materials, these nanoparticles, for biology, oddly enough, in sensing and medical applications. But I knew nothing about biology. I knew nothing about the biological world. And so I decided as a postdoc that I wanted to learn a little bit about biology. And so I did a postdoc at the Faculty of Dentistry on nanostructured biomaterials, so implantable materials. And so that sort of opened the biological world to me. And then ultimately, as a faculty, remember when I got my own group, I kind of blended the two worlds and hence the position in nanobio science.
Speak to us a little bit about your current research interests.
My group works on light emitting nanoparticles, as I mentioned earlier, luminescent nanoparticles. And so the research is essentially at the interface between chemistry, materials, science and engineering, and biology and medicine, where we make new nanoparticles through various wet chemical means. We studied their photophysics, essentially understand how they emit light. And then we apply them to various problems in biology and medicine, such as, for example, we use them as imaging probes for diagnosis of disease. We use them in therapeutics, where we do stuff like drug delivery and photodynamic therapy. And so basically, the sort of overarching theme of the group is to make these multifunctional light emitting nanoparticles that can do a bunch of things, again, always in the area of nanomedicine and biology.
Are you involved solely in the development of such luminescent devices, or are you looking also at applicability?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, that's the beauty of research, and particularly multidisciplinary research such as this, is that one can't be, for lack of a better word, jack of all trades. And I think to really succeed, you need collaboration. You need to collaborate with experts in the respective fields. For example, my group, we are experts in chemistry and in the functionalization and the characterization of these nanoparticles, but we are not experts in the biological world. And so we collaborate with groups around the world. And again, depending on the application, be it biologists, be it medical doctors, MDs, for particular applications.
So now that you are at the INRS full time, what's your day-to-day like? Are you leading a team of researchers? Are you more the innovator behind the scenes, or do you still find yourself in the lab day to day?
That's a great question. So now I'm on the other side of the desk, essentially. As a professor, basically, I have my own team, and that team is comprised of students, mostly at the PhD level, some master's level, occasionally an undergraduate student that will do some work in my lab, and some postdocs. as the head of the lab, as the professor, I essentially drive the research direction. So, we have kind of grand theme of the laboratory. As a result, I need to find the funds to sort of drive this direction. And that involves writing grants to public funding agencies, interaction with some industrial partners for funding. And so these funds are used to buy equipment, to basically pay for the day-to-day costs of operating the laboratory in terms of consumables, in terms of materials, what we call user fees, and that's to access other equipment. That's on sort of a pay-per-use basis. But most importantly, these funds are used to pay the salary of my team, essentially. So there's never a dull day. It's basically my days could be spent writing grants, writing proposals, discussing with the team members about their results. So I don't get into the lab anymore. The day-to-day experiments are done by the team, by the students and the postdocs. But again, the days could be filled with group meetings, discussing their results, deciding on future research directions or future experiments for them. We meet with collaborators around the world, discuss joint projects. My day is never dull, shall we say.
Truthfully, do you miss being in the lab and getting your hands dirty sometimes?
I do, I really do, and it's funny because I talk with my colleagues, and a lot of my colleagues are in the same boat, and I say this in complete honesty that I have equipment that I don't even know how to turn on. I really don't. There's
You
just
know,
not enough hours in a day.
like full credit to John, right? I remember when I first started in his lab, one of the things that impressed me was here was this guy who first came to work and teach in a suit and a tie. That was the
Yes.
first thing that always impressed me about the man was he just looked professional. But then when he first brought me and another student to start in the lab for one of our research projects, what always struck me was that he'd get into the lab, the coat would whip off, the sleeves would get rolled up, and he was ready to go. Now, admittedly, at some point, as you and I were in the lab, his knowledge of the facility started to erode somewhat as he kind of moved his station in life. But that was the one thing that always struck me about him and that I respected was that he knew what he was doing in the lab. He wasn't there every day, but he could get his sleeves dirty if he wanted to.
And I think from that experience, kind of traumatized me. I remember spending weeks aligning lasers,
So
to
true.
get just the right wavelength, just the right amount of power, and only for someone to come in and turn a knob, and basically it all went to hell. And so for that reason, I try um, to kind of keep my hands off the equipment. I do get to the lab, of course. I mean, I visit. I go see what they're doing and what everybody's doing and how the experiments are going. I just personally don't do any experiments anymore.
Yeah. Back to the original question about soccer. So now you
Yes.
lead a team at one of the highest stations that a PhD in chemistry could possibly hope to have. You're leading a research team.
Mhm.
Thinking back to again your time playing soccer and those lessons learned, in what way did your marriage now between your athletics and your academics really help serve you now in your current position?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the to be good on game day, you need to practice hard. That left an impression on me also in my academic life. So, preparing for lectures or preparing for seminars or anything. I mean, I've always felt me that I need to be at my best in order to be able to perform on that given day. But also, I think teamwork is incredibly important because no matter how good you are in soccer or in life, I mean, you can't do it alone. I rely on my team. I rely on my students and my postdocs, and I take great pride, to be honest, when I see them succeed, when I see that the fruits of their labor is published in a paper, in an international peer-reviewed journal, when they are invited to give a talk, or when they get positions of, their own positions, their own labs, or their own prestigious positions in industry. That gives me great pride. So I really think that teamwork is incredibly important.
One of the things I always respected when we were students in John's lab was how we treated almost every day like game day. I think it helped build the same sort of work ethic that I now bring to my current station. We pushed each other, we held each other up, and when it was
Mhm.
time for those big presentations, those big talks we had to give, it was almost like we raked each other over the coals to make sure we knew what we were doing because we knew it was at stake. It was the reputation of the lab and it was our own personal reputation in those circles. And part of that too, again, I never made it as far in soccer as you did, but those were lessons I learned from sport too. And I know that we have many listeners that play sports, varsity level, at professional level. We have elite athletes in our program that when they listen to this, I hope that they take home that your efforts in sports helps fuel who you are and what kind of person you're going to be in your field if you could find a way to connect the two, your academics and your athletics.
Absolutely, and I took a lot of those lessons with me, into my own lab. And anytime a student has a presentation, a seminar to give, we all meet as a group, and we essentially, like you said, rake them over the coals. Because my philosophy, a little bit like John Capobianco's, but I'd rather you get, for lack of a better word, killed behind closed doors between us than not be prepared when you give that talk in front of somebody. And so, we go at them hard, and we need to make sure that they're prepared, that they're ready. And again, this is something that I learned from sports, but also in John's lab.
So in talking about all this, it dawns on me that we haven't discussed an important element of science and research, and it's the element that really prompted this need for us to support each other. And what it is that science can unfortunately be very cutthroat at times. There's often competition between researchers who are striving towards the same goals, and sometimes that becomes unhealthy competition. Sometimes it becomes a culture then that deters people from continuing in research. There's this pressure to publish, this pressure to produce. And you really need sort of a lot of grit and a lot of sandpaper at times to make it through it. Could you speak a little bit about the experiences in going to your postdoc and to becoming a full professor and how challenging that could be to achieve?
As you mentioned, science is, particularly academic science, is a cutthroat business, and there is a very, very kind of competitive mentality that I think is inherent in the system, and comes from this kind of publish or perish mentality. As a scientist, as an academic, our worth, I guess, for lack of a better word, is measured in number of publications, the journals where you publish your work in, and these journals have a certain prestige factor to them called the impact factor. How many times your work has been cited to the general community. So if I publish X papers and they've been cited Y times, the larger that Y number is, the more prestigious scientist you are.
There's also the money factor too, right? That you've got to secure your grants, you've got to secure your funding, and that doesn't come without the support of those papers and the support of your research being something that's respected by the scientific community at large.
That's right. It all comes down to this, again, this tenure track system where when you're hired as an assistant professor and then you move up the sort of the academic ladder to an associate professor, then to a full professor, the big jump really comes from an assistant professor to an associate professor, where you have to undergo what's called the tenure process. And so after you're initially hired kind of on probation for 5 years or so, depending on the university, is a little different, but between 5 and 6 years. And then you apply for tenure. And then you're judged by your peers, other faculty members, experts in the field outside of your university, and they essentially determine if you get promoted. And if you're promoted, you get what we call tenure, and then at that point you essentially have your position for as long as you want it. If you don't, unfortunately, you done. And you may have to find a new line of work, either try, I don't know, the university perhaps, or maybe go into industry, or do something else. So the first 5 years are very incredibly competitive. And again, and you're really judged on how much money you bring in. So you have to basically, as an academic, I remember my first day. It's basically I walked into an empty lab and an empty office, and pretty much got a pat on the back that said, "Get to it." And so you have to find the grants in order to bring in money so that you can buy equipment, so that you can pay your students, pay your research staff, and that's all on you. And the more money you bring in, then the more staff you have, and then the more research you can do, and the more papers get published, and the more papers get published, the higher your impact and your stature in the field. The first 5 years are really, really tough. Once you get tenure and you become a sort of associate professor, and then you can kind of take your foot off the gas a little bit, and maybe get back to enjoying the science, which is where I'm at now. Really, is really enjoying the science, and a little pressure in terms of what I talked about.
I imagine what you need to do in order to stay in that game too during that period of getting tenure is to also try to remember what you enjoy about researching science in the first place, right?
Totally true. I think at least in my case, the first few years you kind of forgot, maybe question why you're doing this. I mean, it's an incredible amount of pressure. But yeah, I think once the nice, the flip side and the nice thing is that once you do get tenure, then you can really enjoy doing research. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that I don't know, I don't really think I have a job. I'm paid for my hobby and for doing something that I love, essentially.
Do you think that same pressure exists now as it did, say, 10 years ago for students to publish or perish? Has that culture changed at all, or is there sort of a paradigm shift?
No, in fact, I believe it's gotten worse. There's been an incredible increase in the number of journals that one can publish to. Students are under a lot of pressure in order to publish. Again, as I mentioned, publications are the scientific currency. And so, in order to proceed to the next step, whether you're going from a master's to a PhD, or from a PhD to a postdoc, or from a postdoc to a faculty position, the more publications you have, the more doors open for you. So a lot of students are aware of this, and are feel the pressure in order to, the experiments don't work, or the project you gave them may have been a little bit ambitious, and it's not really working out as you had planned in your head, and so they kind of feel the pressure, like, I got to publish, I have to publish because I have to apply for this grant for a postdoc, or I'm looking for a faculty position, and if I don't have a paper in these journals, then maybe I won't get hired. So no, I think it's actually gotten worse now.
Do you see any socioeconomic barriers for students as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a problem in the academic world with equity and inclusion. I think it's harder for students who are perhaps new immigrants or come from less affluent means, and they may have other pressures. For example, they may have to hold a part-time job, and they can't just focus all their energy on research and writing papers and reading papers. They might have to go work, to make money to help the family, or keep them going through school. So I think there's still a big step to be taken, a lot of work to do to level the playing field.
What advice would you have for young people navigating their own career path at this stage? Some of the people listening to this are just starting in CEGEP. Some of them are maybe going off into university. Some of the listeners may even just be in high school, still sort of swimming the waters and figuring out what they want to do with their life. Do you have any advice for young people who are trying to figure out what their career direction is, be it in science or otherwise?
Well, I think it's important to follow your dream and never shy away from hard work and putting in the sacrifice that's required to succeed. Nothing that's good in life will come easily. You'll have to fight every inch of the way. So follow your dream and work your tail off, and then you'll see, you'll get a position, you'll get a job eventually that you enjoy. And if you get a job that you enjoy, when you get up in the morning and you're actually happy to go to work, you'll never work a day in your life.
That's some great advice, Fior. I want to thank you again for agreeing to do this. It was really wonderful getting a chance to catch up with you. And I hope again that our listeners take something from this discussion. All the best to you, your lab, and I hope to see you soon, bud.
Thank you, Sean. It was definitely a pleasure, and yeah, let's do this again.
And so concludes this episode of the podcast series Careers in Science. I've been your host, Sean Hughes. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe to the page. And if you have suggestions for any other careers you'd like to see profiled in this series, be sure to leave a comment. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.